Now, some news on Afghanistan, where I gotta say it's been harder to nail down exactly what's going on there since the U.S. has pulled out. There have been some big and major claims about how cruel the Taliban have been. So I'm gonna try to get into that. And Scott Horton recently, in the past couple of weeks, interviewed Andrew Quilty, who is actually still on the ground in Kabul, and so I think he gives a pretty interesting take. But I read this story by CNN, and I've also seen it in BBC and a couple other outlets now, about Afghan families selling, particularly it seems, their young daughters into essentially slavery or child marriages in order to feed the rest of their families. Now, I gotta say, I'm kind of skeptical of the reporting here, just because the CNN story, they're saying, they're selling this girl as the second girl in the family that they've sold already this year, and that she's basically going to be a servant at another family, and that was like $2,000 or something, where you would think if the CNN knew about this, that they could maybe get that family $2,000 to prevent this sale from happening or something. There's just some questionable things going on with those stories. However, the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is very, very bad right now. I've heard a couple of problems. One, they say that there's a currency crisis where there's not enough money to go around, and so people can't buy anything. Now, I guess that in a sense doesn't make sense to me, because if no, I could buy anything, it's not like the farmers are going to let the food expire. It'll eventually like start to come down to and maybe just market forces take a little bit of time to work for that to actually happen, or it's that all the money in Afghanistan was like kind of consolidated and stolen over the past 20 years, and so now that the people who were just like kind of subsistent level, which was most of Afghans, who really just whatever aid package that they were getting from the people at the refugee camp that they were living in, or whatever kind of cash payment maybe system that they were getting from the Afghan government, all that stuff is now gone. And so all these people who are essentially living day to day, week to week, month to month, or whatever, on welfare, they no longer have money. And so I'm not exactly sure if it's more that, where uh, I don't know, that just to say that there's enough currency doesn't sound exactly right to me. From a libertarian standpoint, it sounds like there's not enough money for the people who are really desperate and need it. And then also, with all the foreign aid drying up in Afghanistan, there's a lot of jobs that now don't have funding, civil service jobs. I haven't really heard trash collectors, but I would guess stuff like that is probably being left undone, because whatever foreign country that was pouring in the aid for that is no longer doing so. But definitely, I've heard like teachers and nurses and stuff like that. All this was coming from foreign international funding before, and so now that that's all that money has dried up, those people are going without being paid. And so it seems like there is quite a bit of suffering going on in Afghanistan, and of course it is about to enter winter in Afghanistan, which it is a harsher time of year to try to survive, especially for these people in refugee camps and everything like that. And so I mean, it's kind of all being blamed on the Taliban, which I don't think makes a lot of sense. The Western countries poured millions of dollars, billions, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars into Afghanistan over the past 20 years. And if the system that they set up was so fragile that was able to fall apart in a month, and now just, 2 months later, the people are already starving to death, well, then, the system that was set up was just completely fragile and unsustainable. However, I think it's a lot more than that, because the U.S. government has responded by freezing the Afghan government assets, and also with the sanctions on Afghanistan, makes it a lot harder to get aid in. Even if they say there are exceptions for aid and all that, we've talked about this in Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Cuba, what have you. All these countries, even though they say, oh, we make exceptions for medicine and food and all that stuff, the exceptions really don't work. The international money community doesn't want to do business with countries like Afghanistan, who are ruled by the Taliban, like the Iranian government and stuff like that. And so they can't bring in medications, and also they label everything vaguely dual use, and so you can't get into Afghanistan with batteries or masks or something like that because they could potentially be used for some kind of military purpose or operations. Um, so there's a lot of problems, right, with the way the U.S. is doing this and the harm it's inflicted on the Afghans by doing so. However, the Taliban aren't completely blameless here. In that Quilty interview with Scott Horton, he points out that despite the Taliban promises, it definitely hasn't come to fruition. That women haven't been quite as elevated as they said they were as they were coming to power. That minority groups haven't been quite as elevated since the Taliban came to power. That being said, he says there's like not a systematic targeting of former like Afghan government employees or officials or anything like that, although several have been targeted and assassinated. Although, as he kind of acknowledges in this interview, it could be like almost grievances, right? Like this has been a 20-year long war, and so Afghan commandos that were backed by the CIA or even the Pentagon, carried out some horrific crimes during the past 20 years. And if somebody is looking for reprisal for their son, daughter, family being killed, something like that, well, those kind of things do happen a little bit. And since the Taliban essentially won the war, that side's going to be the one that's carrying out the kind of reprisals. And so I'm not sure if it's that or maybe in some places in Afghanistan, the central Taliban have a little bit less control, and so local commanders just are kind of taking out people who they want to take out. Let's see, anything else? Oh, one thing he did mention, and I have seen in other articles as well, is while a lot of the girls' schools haven't opened in Afghanistan, and while that is at least in part due to the Taliban rules and restrictions, it also is in part to just the shortage of teachers due to a lack of funding. One of the things that is very unfortunate about the way the Taliban have carried out their sexist policies and all that with trying to segregate schools and everything like that. Well, if you had 20 students in the sixth grade class, 10 boys, 10 girls before, and that's one teacher. Now you have 10 boys in one class and 10 girls in another class. Well, now you need two teachers. And the way the Taliban work, and this is very unfortunate, that the boys are going to be the ones that get the instruction and not the girls, I'm guessing, in almost all those cases. And so that would be a reason for like the U.S. to allow in more aid to Afghanistan, because some of it is going to get to teachers, put people to work, get people to the point where at least it's not able to be reported by CNN, even if it's untrue, that people are selling their daughters into slavery and crazy stuff like this. Let's see, anything else on Afghan? Well, I got a bunch of other stuff on Afghanistan. So let's talk about the USA to Afghanistan, kind of looking back. Well, I just got this real quick. The Taliban are once again calling for the U.S. to release the billions in frozen assets, saying that currency would really help them to stop people from starving. Of course, I'm sure they're going to use some of the money on anti-ISIS operations and other stuff like that, for their own military, for their own corruption and cronyism and all that kind of stuff that every government, including the Taliban government, will do. Some of it will probably get into the hands of the people, at least if the money is released and then the Afghan people are suffering, they're more likely to blame the Taliban, whereas now the Taliban have a pretty good scapegoat in the U.S. because we're freezing all the money. But there's a story here from Roll Call titled U.S. Rarely Enforced Conditions on Afghan Aid Audit, it says. And this is an audit looking at a bunch of the military aid that the U.S. gave to the Afghan National Army, and found that even though they conditioned the money, saying that, look, you got me standard A, B, C, and D, provide receipts for all this, show us where the money is going, show us where these troops are, prove they're not ghost soldiers and all that. That this often didn't happen, and they just ignored their own conditions. And it says U.S. officials lost considerable control over spending that totaled nearly $89 billion. And so if you're now the Americans 2 months after you left and realize that $89 $1 billion in a country where they're alleging that children are being sold for $2,000. But nonetheless, even if that's not happening, in a country where just a few $1,000s is an absolutely life changing amount of money, the fact that we just gave away billions of dollars, including a lot of the money going to the Taliban in the form of either bribes or essentially hiring Taliban workers to carry out different activities, building projects, and all that's happened over the past 20 years. It's just completely ridiculous for the American people to now think that all the suffering happening in Afghanistan is because of the Taliban. We also had some interesting things happening with the State Department and reports of the aid. And this comes from the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. That office is run by John Sopko, and they say that after and as the Afghan government was falling, they had a request from the State Department to remove all of the audit, inspection, and financial audit reports from the Cigar website. And it said that it needed to remove that to protect its Afghan allies. And he said that, initially the office did comply with this request because, you say that people are in danger, then we'll take it down. But then they asked for and they write or he says, but despite repeated requests, state was never able to describe any specific threats to individuals that were supposedly contained in our reports, nor did state ever explain how removing our reports now could possibly protect anyone, since many were years old and extensively disseminated worldwide. And so he says, look, these reports are out here, they're public information, and the State Department can't even pull that back. And so this is concerning, and it seems like trying to take down this information at a time where having this easy access to would be beneficial for reporters trying to figure out what the hell happened in Afghanistan, how it went so poorly so quickly, and they were clearly trying to hide that information. And it seems like maybe it's a coordinated thing happening in the Biden administration, as we have the Pentagon quietly removing, and this is from Task and Purpose, the Pentagon quietly removed more than 130,000 Afghan war photos and videos from public view. One of the pictures is actually on the screen now for people who aren't watching. Looks like 3 American soldiers sleeping with a dog, and one of the soldiers has on a Washington Redskins blanket. And no photo picture face of anyone or anything that could possibly be identifiable as anything. And this picture, along with 120,000 other photos and 17,000 videos, were removed from the website, saying that it has to go through and look at all that to see if it's actually able to be disseminated to the American people, even though that this has been in public view for a long time. And so, you wonder if it's already been in public view, if the decision to take it down now is more about depriving the public of this potential information, just like removing the financial reports, rather than about concern for anybody's safety, especially since one of the pictures that we see clearly couldn't be used to identify or target anyone. All right, let's move on to some things that happening in Afghanistan. Just a week or so ago, we had a Taliban raid in the city of Herat, where there was an allegation, I guess, of some ISIS-K kidnappers hanging out. The Taliban claim, I think they killed 4 of the kidnappers, and the reports say that 10 civilians were among the 16 dead. 8 homes were destroyed. And so, one of the things here is that the Taliban do have collateral damage in their anti-ISIS operations, just like the United States does. One thing, if it's carried out by the Taliban, the blowback, is directed within Afghanistan. Also, the Taliban are probably going to be less likely to, just be fooled and kill the wrong people like the Americans were so many times during the past 20 years. But Also, another thing to point out and realize here that it is the Taliban who are more than willing to engage in operations against the Islamic State. We had this here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. He writes, the Wall Street Journal reported Sunday that some former members of the now defunct US-backed Afghan government's intelligence and military forces have joined the local ISIS affiliate known as ISIS-K. The journal cited people who knew several men who joined up with ISIS-K after the US withdrawal. The report says the number of defectors who joined ISIS-K is relatively small but continues to grow. Very interesting here how the Taliban are like the mortal enemies of the ISIS-K, and they oppose them no matter if they're if the Americans are there or not. But when the American government leaves, a bunch of our former allies, or not a bunch, but at least some of our former allies go and enlist with ISIS-K. One last thing going on in Afghanistan that I wanted to cover, and that is 25 people today were killed in an attack on a hospital in Kabul. It was apparently a military hospital. 50 more people were wounded. It's exactly unclear at this point who carried out the attack, but it has ISIS-K written all over it. 5 attackers, 2 suicide bomber, 3 gunmen. I guess one of the gunmen was captured by Taliban security. Not exactly sure if this military hospital had any civilian uses at all. Maybe with the desperate state right now in Afghanistan, maybe with like the change in who controls Afghanistan, they're treating civilian patients too. And I have to imagine that any hospital capacity to being taken out in Kabul right now could have some pretty serious long-term consequences.